Hey everyone, so today we're going to get into the front end. So to start, some of you may have seen my post, but I wanted to touch up these roll arms, and I didn't want to get into powder because when you start pulling out sphericals and everything out, pressing them out, you actually destroy them, from what Jed told me, and then you're buying all new parts. So he suggested this Krylon Fusion all-in-one. It's a textured paint. It's a primer and paint in one, and kind of hard to tell. You know, you'll still see the nicks in there. I sanded them down lightly, but overall, most people will never notice, honestly. I had done it. I bought a gloss black in this as well to match the swing arm. So I did the gloss black first, and that looked like crap because gloss just shows everything. Where if you add even a light texture, it's gonna mask a lot of that stuff. So again, I just kind of lightly sanded the chips in it and sprayed it on. Obviously the one side that's facing out has considerable chips, but looks a lot better than it did. So when we get into the front end, I'll start with the bolts. There's two types you can use. You can use the socket head, the Allen wrench head, or you can use like a spec bolt. They sell a kit with the flanged, more OEM style. Either one is fine. Spec bolt, the 89, for some reason their bolts are longer. So the spec bolt actually sells an 86, 87, then an 88 and an 89. I don't really understand why, because the mounts are all the same. So I just order the 89 for all mine. For this one, I'm actually going to reuse, these are the ones off my race bike, because I'm going to put new ones on that. But, you know, if you, washers versus no washers, if you're using the socket heads, definitely use a washer. If you're using the flanged, you don't need a washer. A lot of times I use a washer because I feel like it helps protect the powder a little bit better from taking them on and off. And every washer has a flat side and a rounded side, as I'm sure you all know. I know the proper way to install a washer is the flat side in. However, I do it in reverse, so that it makes less contact with the powder. So that's how I have all these set up. So again, bolts doesn't matter. The next thing you want to do after a freshly powdered frame comes back is you're going to have powder inside of all the bolt holes, and you'll try to slide a bolt in and it won't go in. So what I do with all my holes is I just put the bolt in, spin it around until it comes looser, and then I'll actually almost saw it away. And trust me, you'll thank me later, because when you're putting the arms on, it's much easier if they just slide right in, as opposed to getting them in. Then you have to thread them into the powder, and then you're using a wrench or an Allen wrench or a socket or something and getting them all in. So I've already done these except for this one, so you can see that is not pushing in. So I just get it in there, spin it, and it'll start to loosen up. You'll see some powder come off, and then you can just saw those away. So now I know that all my, and usually where it hangs up is not on the threads so much because they're slightly thinner, slightly narrower. It'll hang up, you know, when the step up comes in for the, you know, the solid piece. So then I test them all, make sure they all go in pretty nice, and once they're good, now I know that they're going to slide, my arms are going to slide on a lot easier. So that's just a little trick I do. You don't have to, but it does make life easier. So the next thing is, if you have roll arms, you're going to have these stainless bushings that go in. And I see questions, guys asking when they get new roll arms, should I use grease? Yes, you want to grease these fittings, the insides of them. They have little dimples in them that actually hold the grease. So it doesn't matter what grease you use. I always use Lucas Oil Red and Tacky. I just like it's just thicker. It's kind of what I've gone with. You use marine grease, whatever you want. So I'll put a squirt in on each side. It's a little bit harder to do when I'm filming. And don't worry if it comes out, spin it around, put one on each side, and then I'll get my little finger in there and spin it around. And there's a space between the Teflon bushings, or the spacer, I guess they're bushings, inserts in there. So I just get it in there, spin it around, make sure it gets in all those dimples. It's okay if you have excess in the center, because that probably is a good thing if it needs to work itself out. So then once we have that, now we can slide our bushings in. And sorry the angle's not the best on this, but that's what I have. So we'll get one in, we'll get two in, and now these are ready to go. The upper I already did. Alright, so once we have that, for the roll arms, make sure they're facing the right direction. They always have a kind of a taper to them, and you can see, this one is more straight, this one is more of an angle. You want where it's going to push the tire forward. So usually the steeper angle goes to the back. Well, not usually, always. Alright, and then we get these plastic washers that slide onto the ends. And it actually helps if you have a little bit of grease on each, even if it's just a dab, because it keeps these things in place while you're installing. So now that I have that, I'll just wipe off any excess grease on the outside. This one I have a ton of grease inside the bushing, no big deal. So now we'll slide it in, and sometimes you have to pull those washers in. And now you get your dead blow, and angle it down, and tap it in. And these you usually have to play with a little bit, get them lined up. Up and down. I want to get those looking really good so that those bolts slide right in, because these things the tolerance is very tight. So if one side is off, when you try to put your bolt in, it's not going to go. So just take your time, tap it in. The dead blow, you're not going to hurt your powder. So now I can take my bolt and put it in. And you'll find out really quick if it's lined up, because this one I can't tell because it's fully greased. So sometimes you can just spin it, get one side started. Now I'm going to go the other side. As far as the direction your bolt should go in, I put my forward bolt in facing out. And that's only because in a race situation, if I ever need to quickly swap something out, I have easy access to it with the impact. For normal riders that don't take their bikes apart much or don't check your bolts, I don't recommend that because it's sitting at an angle, and if that nut ever comes off, there's a chance that bolt can back out. So, I would recommend sticking with the normal direction going down. Sometimes these look like they're right on, but they still give you a hard time. So once you feel like it's kind of wants to go in, you can lightly tap on it. Don't want to use too much force because you don't want to mess with those threads. So once, if I need to, get my Allen out. And a lot of times, once the threads get past a certain point, then the rest of it will just slide right in. Like that. Okay, so we get one side in. There, so that one's already better aligned. Hits the other side. It's actually sometimes easier to use the flange bolts because then you just can ratchet it rather than trying to use the Allen. Hopefully this mount isn't bent at all. You know, this is a new frame. Seem a little bit off. Alright, well, I'm going to have to take a look into that one a little bit farther. You know, there's always a chance that one of these mounts could have gotten tweaked. But we can go ahead and do the tops. The top of this one, put your washers on. I had them all. The joys of filming. The outtakes. Oh, here it is. I roll. Okay. So, put this in. Make sure your pin is pointing down. Tap it in. Always nice when they slide right in. That's what she said. Alright. So now I got my washers on the other side. Now with the roll arms, if you watch my A-arm video, the roll arms have no adjustments on the inners where they mount. So there's no need to keep everything loose as with other arms, because you're not going to, once these are on, you're not going to mess with them. I'm not going to tighten everything down now, because I still have to fix that bottom one. I'm just going to get these on loosely. I'll go back and check out what's going on with that bottom mount. And again, on these nuts, I'm putting I'm going to leave that bottom one off. All right, so now we've got our arms on. Next thing we'll do is our spindle. So with the spindle, this is the one you want to leave loose. You don't want to lock it in. And there's a taper on the pins so that once it locks it in, it really goes on there. And I have a special tool that Motion Pro makes to remove the spindle pins or the ball joints. I used to fight with it all the time. Went to Home Depot, bought some grade 8 bolts, and nuts, and then tried to do it that way. That never worked out well. It was a pain. So I finally broke down and bought the Motion Pro tool, and that works great. So I just want to snug these down. And one thing I'll say that I've learned building all these bikes, you have nylock nuts, you have the locking nuts with the little steel inner thing, and then you have castle nuts. What I don't like about nylock nuts on spindles is they tend to want to spin the whole pin. They're hard to get off, even if those pins are locked in, you know, if they're loose at all. The other thing is with the nylocks, especially under tie rods, Gland Innovations makes a castle nut upgrade. And the reason for that is because I've actually had the nylock nut come loose on a tie rod end, and it was just flopping around. Now, imagine what would have happened if that fell off in a race. That would have been a messy situation. So at least with the castle nut, you put a pin through it, and if it loosens, it can only back out so far. And usually with the castle nuts, where the hole is in the pin, it's going to be above where it locks into where the slots are in the castle nut, but that's okay. At least it has a point where it's going to stop, and it'll get you through the race. You're not going to have to worry about crashing and going over the bars or something like that. You know, it just could be a really bad situation. So, okay, our spindle is on. Now we can slide our, now, one thing I will say, and I didn't clean this yet. So, these, if you have LSR hubs, they have these caps. Well, I hit a rock with this cap in a race, and I knew it dented it, but I didn't think it was an issue. Well, the problem is water got in there, and it's hard to see, but it totally corroded my nut, and what it did is it actually corroded the bushing in the spindle or in the hub, so it was starting to seize onto the spindle shaft. So that's what's kind of hanging up right now. So if you have LSR hubs like this, you got one of two options. Make sure you inspect these caps. If it has a dent, it's probably going to crack. If it does, just take it off. If you do, make sure they're in good shape and make sure this seal's in there. And you know, make sure that's all good, because once that started to corrode, I actually had to really kind of tap the heck out of this to get that corrosion to let loose on the bushing there. So I have a new nut I can put on. This one's fine. It's just a little not as pretty. So we'll put that on, and always inspect your rotors. You can see if they're straight. Most rotor, unless they're brand new, they may have a very slight wobble to them. But I've seen some, a guy that I helped with at the last Works race, he's like, oh, you know, my tires won't spin. I took it off, and it was literally like crazy. So you know, I was able to straighten it out pretty well with a hammer for the race. But I told him, I'm like, you need new rotors, because these are, and what it did is it actually it was so bad, it wore a notch, an angled notch into the brake pads. So he wasn't getting good braking as well because it wasn't making contact. Okay, so we got that. And you can put, normally you put the caliper on. I actually forgot the caliper. So we're kind of at a point now. One other thing. The ball joints or your kingpins, you're gonna put pins through them. And I used to make this mistake all the time, and I actually forgot to do it again right now. So I'm going to remove the nut, and I'm just going to take a small Allen, and I'm going to spin that pin. I'm going to spin the pin so that I can actually get a cotter pin through it. Because if they're not facing the right direction, you're going to be trying to put a pin from the inside, and it's going to hit the spindle, and you're going to be cursing at it, and then it's going to be harder to remove. So make sure you check that. It's a step that's easily forgotten, and that has to do, you know, with tie rods and everything. Anytime you have something that works with a cotter pin where it could hit something else, just check that out and spin it. And once you spin it, usually after you put the nut, start putting the nut on, it'll stay in place. So both of these were off. So put those in a good position. Now I'm not going to have any issues with the pins. I've had times where it was off and I had to cut the pin because it was hitting the spindle. And once you cut a pin, if you try to bend that little piece, it's going to be really hard to get off. So that's basically our front end, the initial setup. So for the tie rods, now it's going to be hard to see. What I do when I get tie rods is I always want these on as even as possible for the adjustment. So I'll spin one side on just until the threads catch, and then I'll spin the other side on just until the threads catch, so they're about even. And then what I'll do is I'll take this, put it on the floor, and I'll start spinning the rod. keeping these within contact in the floor. And you can't see this, but what that's going to do is it's going to give me even thread on both sides. Okay, so now they're even. I know they're even. Make sure they don't turn, because the next thing you're going to do is measure. I always like to start with my tie rods the same length. So here I'm about almost at 19 inches. And here I'm right at 19 inches. So in that case, you can turn one side. Because if you can get the front end to align. That's good right there. You can get the front end to align, but if your tie rods are off, it's going to pull to one side, kind of like a car. So now that I know that these are at the same side, and I intentionally messed these up for you guys. These came off my race bike, so they were already set, and I knew it was direct swap, but I want to go through this process and show you guys the proper setup. So when you put your tie rod in, the steering stem side, at least on a 250R, always goes on top. If you're having weird issues to where it seems to work better with it on the bottom, it's not right. Now with 250R spindles, the other side goes on top of the arm. But with 450R spindles, it goes on the bottom. So keep that in mind. And that was something that I always used to forget with the 250R, whether it went on the top or the bottom. So we get those in, we'll snug them up. They can be tightened down now once you have everything else on. The other thing I want to do is I'm going to loosen this before I tighten this down and mess up the camber, because this adjustment here, this heim, is for the camber on the roll arms. So I'm going to do that because this one I knew was going to go a little bit long, so I'm not going to do the shock adjustment and everything else, or the shock length. I'm going to do that in the next video. But I'll basically have this whole thing together as a roller, and all my geometry is messed up at this point. Once I loosen this, I'm going to spin this out a few. It's going to whack my camber out, and then we'll be able to go through the process of setting it. So that's pretty simple. There might be some tricks in there that you learned, I hope. And obviously, anything we can do to simplify the build is a good thing, because you're always going to run into an issue somewhere. So if you can eliminate an issue somewhere else, well, it's going to save you some time. So that's it for now. I'm going to film. I'm going to get this buttoned up. The other side's already buttoned up, but I'll get this all set up and shoot the next one tomorrow and get that up for you guys. I have an MX race in 2 weeks. I haven't run an MX race in over a year, so I'm pretty excited, but I want to run this bike, so I'm going to be wrapping this thing up pretty quickly and see what she'll do on the track. All right, guys, that's it for now. See you later.